Good morning, everybody. My name is Eli Lehrer, and I'm the president of the R Street Institute. On behalf of my colleagues and our directors, I'd like to welcome you to this event, which we are proud to sponsor in collaboration with our partners and friends at ICS Village, the Cyberspace Foundation, and the Wilson Center. We're proud to work very closely with ICS Village, a nonprofit that partners with R Street on a multitude of issues, including a monthly podcast, Hack the Plant, that brings monthly conversations with those on the front lines of critical infrastructure. I wanted to say a few words to start about what we all hope to accomplish today. The lifetime of the median age American, 38, has seen the internet metamorphosed from a curiosity to a useful tool to an absolute necessity. Our critical infrastructure is critical to, well, everything. Indeed, I would submit that our cyber infrastructure is now the most important part of our infrastructure because it underlies everything else. No major ship docks, no major commercial flight flies, no goods get delivered to our stores, no money goes into banks, unless data flows through the internet in a reliable manner. As we grow more and more reliant on communicating by these means as well, we're all on video conference today after all. Data aren't just necessary to life, they are life. As such, the issues we discuss and learn about today, cybersecurity, national security, technological innovation, cyber infrastructure, are more vital than ever to understanding the future, its opportunities, and its threats. As a group strongly committed to building a strong cybersecurity infrastructure for our nation, we're proud to be a sponsor and pleased to be here today. The work that all of you do, and the work you are doing, is vital to our country. With that, I am pleased and honored to introduce all of you to our keynote speaker, Congressman Mike Gallagher. Congressman Gallagher is a 7th-generation Wisconsin native and represents Wisconsin's 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives. He joined the United States Marine Corps the day he graduated from college and served 7 years on active duty and was deployed twice to Anbar province, Iraq, as a commander of intelligence teams. He currently serves as co-chair of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and on the House Armed Services and Transportation Infrastructure Committees. Congressman Gallagher, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your service, and thank you for our leadership. It is my pleasure and my honor, our pleasure and our honor, to welcome you. Mike Gallagher, over to you.
Well, thank you, Eli. I really appreciate it. It's great to be with you at Hack the Capitol, albeit virtually. Though, if anything, as you alluded to, I think the virtual format today is fitting because it serves as a critical reminder of the increasing centrality of cybersecurity to our everyday lives. And it's why I'm glad we are here developing the next generation of cyber experts. The unfortunate reality is that things are not going particularly well in cyberspace. While American military power has thus far deterred our adversaries from engaging in cyber attacks that would be tantamount to war, below the level of armed conflict, deterrence is not holding. And in recent years, we've seen devastating cyber intrusions that have impacted our government and every sector of our economy. And so in recognition of these challenges, Congress created the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, comprising 4 sitting legislators, a Republican in the House, a Democrat in the House, a Republican in the Senate, and an independent in the Senate, 4 executive branch leaders, and 6 cybersecurity experts coming from business, academia, and the think tank community. And for nearly 2 years, I've had the privilege of co-chairing the commission alongside my good friend, Senator Angus King. The commission draws its name and inspiration from President Eisenhower's 1953 Project Solarium. At that time, with the Soviet Union looming as an existential threat, Eisenhower tasked his national security team with designing a long-term competitive strategy that would outlast his presidency. And Project Solarium essentially pitted 3 teams of experts against each other to assess 3 alternative strategies of containment, rollback, and massive retaliation. And the 3 of these teams engaged in an intellectual back and forth to debate the proper course of action that ultimately became the Eisenhower administration's New Look grand strategy, NSC 162-2. And so when it came to our commission's task, the modern day Solarium, Congress charged us with answering a fundamental question. What strategic approach will defend the United States against cyber attacks of significant consequence? And so to answer the question, we borrowed a page from the original Solarium and we designed 3 different competitive approaches to cybersecurity: active disruption and cost imposition, denial and defense, and entanglement through norms-based regimes. We stress test each of these approaches in a series of war games at the National Defense University, the scene of the original Project Solarium, funny enough. And we took the best of each to formulate a new strategy that we call layered cyber deterrence. Layered cyber deterrence is an approach that attempts to modernize traditional deterrence mechanism and extend them beyond the government to develop a whole of nation approach. First, we argue that the United States must shape behavior by working together with allies and partners with whom we have shared values and a shared collective interest in a stable cyberspace. That's the first layer of layered cyber deterrence. Second, the U.S. must deny benefits to adversaries who have long exploited cyberspace to their advantage. The public and the private sectors must collaborate to build national resilience and reshape the cyber ecosystem to increase security. That's the second layer. And third and finally, the U.S. must impose costs against malicious actors. This requires the U.S. to maintain the capability, the capacity, and the credibility needed to retaliate against actors who target America in and through cyberspace. That's the third layer. But perhaps our most important finding as a commission is the simple recognition that we believe deterrence is indeed possible in cyberspace. But it's very different from strategic deterrence or that which we associate most closely with the early stage of the old Cold War. The challenge in cyberspace is how we can change an adversary's cost-risk calculus, particularly below the level of armed conflict. At present, we are creating a de facto norm that says significant cyber disruptions are allowable through our inaction. And we need to change this dynamic, and multilateral declarations and agreements alone are not sufficient to do this. We need the willingness to act boldly in concert with our allies to harden our defenses and to create costs for our adversaries swiftly and creatively when they threaten our nation. And that's the goal of layered cyber deterrence. It's to transform us into a better friend, a worse enemy, and a harder target for those who wish to challenge our defenses in cyberspace. And to answer this challenge, the Commission put forth over 80 recommendations, more than 50 of which have a legislative component. Roughly half of these legislative recommendations were either in the House version of the National Defense Authorization Act or the Senate version of the National Defense Authorization Act, and we're currently working with the relevant committees to get as many of these recommendations included in the final report as possible. I'm happy to get into the recommendations and question and answer, but I wanted to just begin at the beginning and peel back the curtain a bit on the Commission's thinking, how we were organized, and why we landed on layered cyber deterrence. I would say one constant throughout was the importance of cultivating in a better way that next generation of cyber warriors, and events like this are a fantastic venue to do just that. And I think that really connects, at least in my mind, to why we think deterrence is possible in cyberspace. Because at the end of the day, we're not deterring cyber tools or bots, we're deterring human beings. And at the end of the day, our ability to do that will be dependent on human beings, whether we can recruit the best and the brightest to work for the federal government or to work for companies in the private sector that are on the front lines of this fight. I would submit that cyber, for all the fancy gadgets and tech and complicated acronyms, is still fundamentally a human enterprise. So with that, I will stop talking and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Bryson, I can't hear you. I don't know if I'm alone in that.
There we go.
But
All
you
right.
have a great beard, perhaps the best one I've seen in a long, long time.
I appreciate that, sir. This is my quarantine beard. I'm helping keep our infrastructure safe through my facial commitment. I'm Bryson Board. I'm the host for Hack the Capitol and Trek One. And thank you very much for the comments and the introduction to our conference. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission, of course, has been a huge strategic endeavor, and we thank both you and Mr. King for leading that. And so the first question is, for those of you who aren't aware, please put your questions and answers down in the app in GoToMeeting, for those of you that are joining us live. And the first question is around the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which is, what do you think is the priorities for what is going to happen in this year and the next from the commission?
Well, I would highlight a few things. I think this really starts with our recommendation for a national cyber director inside the executive office of the president, or NCD, as we call it. The goal of this position would be to provide strategic leadership to U.S. cyber policy making, make our various departments and agencies more effective in pursuing their objectives in cyberspace, create a single point of accountability for congressional oversight, and really to bring clarity to private sector collaboration with the government. And we believe that doing so would help rectify inconsistent cyber policy leadership across multiple administrations over the last 20 years. Second, if you look at the report, you'll see, and we debated this, we debated various approaches. There are some who feel strongly that we need a whole new, different cyber agency. There's all sorts of recommendations, but where we really landed was an effort to elevate and empower the existing agencies that we charge with protecting us in cyberspace. In particular, we recommend properly resourcing CISA and endowing it with the leadership and authorities it requires so that it can meet the ambitious vision that Congress originally had for the agencies. And so we think that with CISA's expertise and the National Cyber Director's leadership at its core, our government will be better equipped to plan and act in concert against threats from cyberspace. We also recommend codifying the important role our sector-specific agencies like Energy and Treasury play in securing our national critical infrastructure. The final thing I'd say, and I think it's something that the pandemic has demonstrated quite clearly, it's that we need to, if we wait until after a crisis to enact our planning, our continuity of the economy planning that we recommend in the report, it's going to be too late. At the early part of the Cold War, we thought through the unthinkable, right? We started to think through how we could survive in the wake of a massive nuclear exchange. And from this emerged all of our plans for continuity of government and continuity of operations, COOP and COG, as they're referred to, as well as our emergency response plan. We think that a similar effort is needed today to think through the unthinkable in terms of a massive cyber attack. And so we recommend continuity of the economy planning, and really to get that level of analysis for how we get our economy back online, identifying and securing the systems, the assets, the private entities that are most critical to U.S. national power. And that's going to require consistent engagement across all sectors and a greater capacity in the government and private sector identify and reduce evolving risk in cyberspace. So those are the three things that jump out to me as even if we're phenomenally successful in the National Defense Authorization Act this year, those are going to be three lines of effort that will continue in the next Congress.
So the history of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, as you called out, goes back to President Eisenhower, when we were looking at a bipolar world where we needed an extreme strategic response to the Soviet Union. It's a two-part question. One, how does that compare today, where it's not as simple as a bipolar world with one simple adversary? We now exist in a multipolar world. And then the second part is, how does the Cyberspace Solarium Commission address domestic elements around issues with cybersecurity and domestic terrorism?
That's a great question. So I should, at the outset, say that what I'm about to say is outside the commission report. So I'm speaking just as Mike Gallagher, not for the commission as a whole. I actually think if you look at the overall structure of the international system right now, there are useful parallels between the old Cold War and what I have called the new Cold War. And I think even if you read the report, you'll see that while we spend a lot of time talking about non-state actors, hacktivists, cyber criminals, and then when it comes to state actors, we go through the whole gamut from North Korea to Iran to Russia and China. I think it's fair to say that when you read the report, it becomes evident that our foremost competitor in cyber, particularly, but more generally geopolitically, is communist China. At least that's my own view. And so I think that provides a useful framework for making tough decisions between what is essential and what is extraneous. And that, after all, is the essence of strategy. So I would say there are maybe some parallels. But as I alluded to in my opening remarks, in contrast to a strategy of containment against the Soviet Union or a deterrent posture against the Soviet Union, which was weighted heavily on the side of strategic deterrence by punishment. In other words, we were going to communicate very clearly to our adversary that if they crossed a certain line or did X, Y, Z, we were prepared to escalate all the way up to a nuclear exchange. In cyber, and therefore deterrence could not be allowed to fail at all because the implications of it failing were horrific. In cyber, we start from a recognition that deterrence, particularly at the lower end of the threshold, is constantly failing. And it really shifts the weight from deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial. It's how do we make ourselves into a harder target and reduce the overall attack surface so our adversaries will be denied the benefits of attacking us in cyber in real time or near real time. The other difference I would highlight, or that really comes through the entire report, is the overwhelming importance of the private sector in a way that I do think is different from our old competition with a Soviet adversary. I mean, over 80% of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector, and we really recommend that the federal government effectuate a cultural shift that's necessary to understand that they exist in many cases in cyberspace to support the private sector, not the other way around. That's why we need to sort of have a better process for sharing useful intelligence information with the private sector rather than just demanding all of their information. And it's why we need to have more flexible mechanisms for allowing people that really have that skill set and have, for example, very scary beards that people in the military may not have, allow them to come and serve in the government for a period of time without forcing them to shave. So I think that's another difference. And your second question was the nature of domestic terrorism in cyber. Well, we do have a lot of recommendations related to the FBI and its ability to tackle domestic cyber actors. We have a robust set of recommendations on election security and how we can do a better job there. And there, I just would highlight the need for a concerted, almost public relations effort to educate our kids on the nature of disinformation in cyberspace and on basic cyber hygiene and cyber literacy. I mean, that should just become something that we start to teach at the earliest stages of K through 12 education, so that people are aware of what they're consuming online and they understand how to survive in a very disaggregated and disintermediated information environment where I think a lot of Americans are struggling to understand, what they're consuming online every single day.
Sir, I promise that when the sequel to Castaway comes out, you will be the first one to get a ticket from me when I'm cast as the lead role instead of Tom Hanks.
You should have like a volleyball with a red handprint behind you. That would just complete the look.
So I appreciate the emphasis on public education. That is the primary purpose of our nonprofit, the ICS Village, and also why this is the third annual Hack the Capitol that we're hosting, to not only provide education to what is typically a fairly obscure space. Most people understand enterprise information technology around data, but the fact that water, electricity, and so much of our modern infrastructure is supported by this amorphous critical infrastructure thing that's back there is the intent of this conference. For those of you who want to hear some more about deterrence, David Sanger will be doing a lunchtime keynote at 12 o'clock Eastern time. Sir, can you share some of the specific highlights that are going to be in the National Defense Authorization Act around critical infrastructure and industrial control systems specifically?
Absolutely. So if you look at a lot of our recommendations in the report, we talk about Congress codifying the concept of systemically important critical infrastructure. So the idea is that entities responsible for systems and assets, underlying our critical functions get the full support they need to deal with additional security requirements consistent with their unique status and importance. We have a variety of recommendations in NDAA on that, such as insulating the entities designated as systemically important critical infrastructure from liability in instances when covered systems and assets are targeted, attacked, or compromises. Giving U.S.-owned entities designated as systemically important critical infrastructure the intelligence warning and support that they need, reviewing and updating the intelligence authorities to increase intelligence support to the broader private sector, and then, as I mentioned before, strengthening and codifying our sector-specific agencies so that we have a better understanding of what DOE is responsible for, what Treasury is responsible for, et cetera, et cetera. So there's probably 30 other recommendations in there. When it relates to ICT related recommendations, I think there, and I'll say this as a Republican, I think there are a lot of my colleagues on my side of the aisle that are uncomfortable anytime you talk about an industrial strategy, right? And I understand it. But the commission has concluded, and I think most national security minded conservatives have concluded, that at least when it comes to key technologies that are going to be critical for our competition with China, we are going to need some industrial or industrial based strategy. That's certainly what we recommend in the report, and what we're hoping to at least make a step forward on in the context of NDAA. So for example, one of our recommendations is on how we can better engage actively and effectively in all the international information and communications technology standards setting bodies, so that we're there at the table arguing against China's vision for what those standards are going to be. We have recommendations on improving our capacity building and consolidating funding of cyber foreign assistance, all sorts of different things. But I think at the broadest possible level, what we're really calling for is the federal government to identify what are those no kidding key technologies where we just can't have supply chains with single points of failure that lead back to Beijing, and where we're going to have a combination of federal funding for R&D, private funding, academic commitment in order to onshore or nearshore the manufacturing of those basic devices. So that's really the intent of the report. How well we'll do in NDAA, the next month will be decisive, and we're having all these obscure, bizarre battles behind the scenes. But let me say I'm cautiously optimistic about our ability to make some progress.
It was excellent highlighting the international component. When we talk about critical infrastructure, we're talking about civilians who are not just American citizens, but civilians who depend on this infrastructure throughout the world. And the adversaries that face us are the same adversaries that are also potentially affecting them. And in this way, we're all one people facing that issue. From a fellow Marine, hoorah, when you have competing priorities between private industry, law enforcement, and intelligence as it relates to cyber, how is the commission or entities working to unify that effort across all of those various components and stakeholders?
Well, that's a great question. Hoorah, whoever the anonymous Marine is out there that asked it. By the way, I've done probably 1 billion Zoom meetings in the last 2 months. I don't think of myself as a vain person, but it's almost impossible not to look at yourself in the little window, no matter where you put it. So if someone can figure out a hack to that whole thing, yeah, exactly. I really think that this is where, because you're always going to have those competing priorities, and there's never going to be complete alignment between the incentives of the private sector and certainly between the imperatives of law enforcement and the intelligence community. But I really think that emphasizes the need for a single belly button, or as my good friend Angus King puts it, a single throat to choke in the federal government that has access to the President of the United States, who has the ability to adjudicate disputes between the interagency and more effectively reach out to the private sector. And I think it further emphasizes the importance of having a director of CISA that is empowered to be a source of constant private sector outreach to manage those very difficult and competing incentives. And so I know there's some concern that the creation of a national cyber director is, putting on another layer of bureaucracy to an already over bureaucratized national security interagency process and cyber process. But we actually viewed it as the opposite. We thought it was the least bureaucratic approach out there. I think building another separate cyber agency or taking CISA away from DHS is both politically impossible and more bureaucratic. And then I think the most bureaucratic option and costly option is doing nothing, because our view as a commission is that doing nothing will result in a massive cyber attack. And then we will go through a 9/11 commission-like process with a intelligence reform and terrorism prevention like act that creates another DHS-like structure, and we want to avoid that. Our goal was to be the 9/11 commission that avoids the 9/11. So again, I just would say there's no perfect way to do it, but all the more reason to have a national cyber director and a CISA director that are empowered to do that outreach to the private sector and adjudicate between competing interagency interests.
So the only thing I'm taking away from all of that is I'm going to text Chris Krebs, the director of CISA right now, and tell him he's getting a promotion.
This is true. This is the Krebs promotion plan. And Krebs also, like you, at times needs a haircut. And his sock game, if you've ever seen Krebs' sock game, it's very hipster, it's very on point, and he's much older than me, but he comes off as like a hip young millennial.
All right, I'm not touching that one, but if you want to see something really interesting, Google TLP red pants.
TLP red pants.
TLP red pants.
I don't trust when hackers tell me to Google obscure things and then all of a sudden my computer will shut down, but I'll make an exception in your case.
Sir, if we wanted to be on your phone, we already would be.
That's true. You probably already are.
So one final question, right? We've talked about what the commission has done. For those of you who missed it, to a question that came in the chat, I posted a link to the report that the Cyberspace Solarium Commission published, and we talked about some of the near-term things with the NDAA. Now let's go a little bit farther into the field, right? We're going to bring out the magic wand. So Representative Gallagher, you get to spin this magic wand. Don't worry, it's not connected to the internet. It's air-gapped. And you get to choose one thing that you really want to see happen in the next 5 years. Independent of politics, budget, reality. What's that one thing that you would like to see happen for us?
Are we talking in cyber? Because if it's non-cyber, obviously it's I want the Packers to win the Super Bowl this year and for the next 5 years. That is a great question. Well, maybe to end on a positive, cheesy note. I think regardless of what your pet issue is, right, in cyber or in the broader national security debate, whether you believe, we need to give CISA the authority to do threat hunting on .gov networks, which I think we do, whether you think we need to push the Pentagon to use the authority we've already given them to be able to make you, Bryson, a colonel because of your unique expertise and therefore get a cadre of non-traditional national security minded people, whether you believe we need to supercharge DIUX or DIU, so that they're being that, you know, really transformative entity that's bridging the gap between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. All of this, in my opinion, should make us realize that we have a huge opportunity right now to rebuild a bipartisan foreign policy consensus. And even where we disagree, we should all be waking up with a sense of urgency to the challenge, not only in cyberspace, but the challenge geopolitically right now. I mean, I do believe we are at the early stages of a long-term competition, the stakes of which are existential right now. And basically from the early 90s to up about 4 or 5 years ago, we either got distracted by things we had to do in the Middle East or what happened after 9/11, or we just got complacent, right? Because we didn't have anyone breathing down our neck. And suddenly now we're awaking to the fact that, all right, we're still the world's sole superpower, but it seems like we can't effectuate the outcomes we want internationally. And so I guess my one thing would be to wave a magic wand and make sure that the craziness that's infecting domestic politics and all these other debates doesn't infect the debate on cybersecurity and geopolitics and America's role in the world more broadly. Because I think we have a huge opportunity right now. And I think our allies are desperate for a transformative vision for the free world going forward. I know our Five Eyes allies are. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I guess I'm saying I just don't want us, you know, those who work on these issues for us to get, because it has been largely bipartisan, and my true friendship with Angus King is evidence of that. I just don't want us to get sucked into the political vortex that's sucking everything else into its wake right now.
No, I think that's well said, and I can tell you on behalf of industry and all of the professionals, and certainly the intent of this conference is these aren't partisan or even bipartisan issues. These are technical truths that we are all facing, and the more that we can go into that with a clear and open discussion around that, the more likely we can face those as a people and as a nation.
I should have said, maybe my one wish is when the robots take over that, you know, they find a useful job for me. I'm a very hard worker. So just put in a good word for me, Bryson, if you don't mind.
I will tell the artificial intelligence to begin the algorithm work now.
Thank you. This is
I
fun.
appreciate
Thank you,
your
guys.
time. Yes, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.